So first up is going to be the state of the butterflies in the United States, a roadmap for butterfly conservation in the 21st century. That's going to be presented by a peer of mine, Kevin Burls, who's the Endangered Species Conservation Biologist with the Xerces Society. As a conservation biologist for the Endangered Species Program, Kevin's efforts with the Xerces focus on protecting the hundreds of butterfly species that inhabit deserts, forests, and grasslands across the western U.S. Kevin's work includes collaborating with land managers and scientists to understand the conservation needs of butterfly species, then advocating for their protection by crafting conservation guidelines and legislation with agencies, policymakers, regional, state, and federal levels. And he's doing this also while residing in Washoe Valley, Nevada. So he's coming to us today from Nevada.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you to Adrian and Amy and everyone else for organizing this summit and inviting me to it and giving me a chance to talk to all of you about some of the work that Xerces Society has been involved with as far as analyzing large-scale butterfly population trends, and also some of the products that we've made that we hope will move our work and the efforts of the general public and folks like you to conserve butterfly populations in the coming decades. So I really appreciate the chance to be here. And I know I was supposed to talk just a tiny bit about myself. So here's photos of me in the field. I have lived in Nevada for the last 18 years. I moved out here for grad school. I met my wife, fell in love with the Great Basin as well, and have stayed here ever since, been studying Nevada butterflies mostly since that time. And I am very enthusiastic about butterfly conservation in the Intermountain West, and I'll lump in Colorado and all of its varied habitats. It's an exciting time, I think, to start to think about butterfly conservation in the future. So I am sure that Steve has talked to you at some point here about the Xerces Society, possibly, but just in case, we are solely dedicated to the conservation of invertebrate wildlife and their habitats. And we have these 5 amazing program areas that we work in. As Steve mentioned, I'm in our Endangered Species program. I also interact quite a bit with our policy program and our community engagement program for things like webinars that we put on, and our podcast, Bug Banter, has been a blast to be on a couple times. And when we're lucky enough, we get to interact with our Pollinator and Agricultural Biodiversity program, who does such amazing work on working lands across the United States. And I will mention that obviously now more than ever, the support of the general public is extremely vital to the work that we and other nonprofits do. So of course, if you find our work inspiring, please do visit our website and make a donation and support this sort of work. So the report that I'm going to discuss is a product of one group of people that were interested in understanding butterfly population trends across the country. Even as late as 2023, we had some varied regional evidence that some, but certainly not all, butterflies were declining in some, but certainly not all locations. And so you can see some of the studies that are listed here. This is a slide that was produced by a colleague of mine in the group, Erica Henry of Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so you can see that there's this, we're garnering more evidence all the time, yet there's a lot of places that just don't have any sort of real regional analysis on butterfly populations as a whole, maybe for some specific species, but more as a whole, that come from longer term monitoring programs. And so with the goal of making this a national analysis, probably the most important thing I could just do right here is recognize the enormous group of people who were involved in this project, which was led by Cheryl Schultz, Elizabeth Crone, and Wayne Thogmartin of USGS. And we were supported by the amazing federal funding provided by the U.S. Geological Survey, Powell Center, which is right in Fort Collins, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So this team, which included a number of ecologists and lepidopterists and conservation biologists and ecological modelers, was involved with gathering data sets for butterfly monitoring. And this is the summary of that list. And you can see it is the second group of people that are obviously equally, if not more important to any of this work. Certainly more important. They're the data gatherers. And any of you that are into the butterfly monitoring world will maybe recognize some of the names that are filtered through this list. I might point out in particular the NABA, North American Butterfly Association 4th of July counts, which have been going on for decades in some locations and include a number of very well-known amateur and professional lepidopterists working on them, as well as a group of group of surveys from various folks that are typically species specific in places like military bases for imperiled or endangered species. And then one larger group that's represented throughout this list work on the pollard-based network. And those surveys are completed a few times a year in a wandering transect style, and they collect abundance and diversity of butterflies. And some of these, especially in places like Illinois and Ohio, have been going on for decades as well. So at the risk of throwing future speaker and colleague in this working group, Nick Haddad, under the proverbial field vehicle, I am not going to talk about the methods of this paper really at all. And I'm actually not even really going to dive into the main results of the scientific publication, which of course is available in a number of different ways, including by emailing me. But the main result that we might talk about is just the decline in butterfly abundance and the way that this varies across the landscape of the lower 48 United States. And so over the years between 2000 and 2020, we estimate in these long-term monitoring sites through these surveys about a 22% decline in total butterfly abundance. And you can see that this decline is not spread evenly across the landscape. Some results that are echoed in this paper that have been found in other places as well is that the desert Southwest, as far as butterfly populations, appears to be in steeper decline than many other portions of the country. And we'll talk a little bit about why that may be in a little bit as well. There are a lot of results in this paper. There are a lot of methods in this paper, and there are a lot of reasonable limitations to this sort of nationwide and even region-wide analysis. One thing that I will point out is that, of course, many of the species, not all, many of the species are widespread species that have not been typical targets of conservation concern. We could get into exactly why that is, but of course, the main reason is because the widespread ones are the ones that are available at many locations and can then be observed by various monitoring programs across a larger geographic area versus needing to be in a particular location. We do have some of those data sets in this analysis, for example, the Hermes copper, but just as one random pick out. But there are also many widespread species that now, because we can count them in many places, they're able to be integrated into these analyses. And so one of the things I'd like to say right away is that our goal of this paper is not to replace those typical targets of conservation. Rare and endemic species face a number of very distinct threats depending on where and when they are existing. And that is not to be displaced by the information that we gain through this analysis. Of course, they have to live side by side, and we have to decide what to do with the information when we see that about a third of the butterflies have disappeared from portions of the Southwest and far Western United States. That is not something that has to be mutually exclusive with the rarities and narrowly distributed species. So the publication that the Xerces Society put out is very similarly named to our working group, State of the Butterflies of the United States. We've added this roadmap for butterfly conservation because, of course, that is our goal, is to find a way to recover some of these declining species, to stop some of these overall population trends. And one of the other main goals was to create a summary of the scientific publication in a way that would be useful to exactly the people that I am talking to in this room today. So I am super excited to be able to tell you all about it. Some of you may have seen this publication already if we've advertised it well enough, but if not, I'm really glad to be able to talk about it. And so one of the things, as I mentioned, to summarize these results, we have simply made regional analyses. Each of these regions are U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service regions. And so they bear some level of ecological similarity, but of course, in the Mountain-Prairie District, I would say almost more than any other, there are many distinct habitats gathered in this Fish and Wildlife Service region. But we've tried to just summarize the main results from the paper as they apply to these regions. We have picked just a few species from the top and or bottom of our population trend changes to highlight. In general, really, I mean, a simpler goal is just to show the diversity of life history traits and species biology and taxonomic diversity that exists at both the top and bottom of these lists. And by these lists, this is the sort of list I am talking about. These are just summaries of the statistically significant increasers and decreasing species and their state by state distributions within the regions based on derived range maps from one of our colleagues in the working group, Eliza Grimes at SUNY Binghamton. And we've also tried to just include tiny vignettes about success stories for species in these regions as well, to point out the ways in which we can look forward to butterfly conservation of some of these other widespread species. Before I get to talking about the solution or our proposals for things that we can all work on together for butterfly conservation, I wanted to take a second because I think one of the related questions that comes up with these new targets, possible targets for conservation action, these widespread species that we maybe see in many habitats all around us at times, and may feel like they are common because of where we can find them, and have certainly, I should say, historically been common. What could be driving these sort of declines? And I think my goal with these next few slides is just to propose the idea that, and try and pitch the idea that there are things that are widespread enough to cause widespread species that feed on common plants to be in steep decline. And we maybe saw some of those at one time period in the past, and we may be seeing another batch of that sort of decline now in the most recent decades. So, of course, one of the most common threats to butterfly populations are these lost, fragmented, and degraded habitats. And this is the map of historical and salmon color and current distribution by county in blue for the regal fritillary, recently proposed for protection by the Fish and Wildlife Service. This is from the recent status assessment. And this is a species that feeds on violets in open areas that are dependent on frequent disturbances. And the things that have changed the distribution on this map are obviously different depending on where the butterfly was at. The causes of declines in prairies in the far eastern United States and Appalachia is a totally different sort of cause than the things that are going on in the Midwest, the upper Midwest, and in Colorado, for example, in the plains areas. So these things could be total loss of habitat in one area, and they might be succession in another area, and it might be nearness to pesticide exposure in a third region. But the habitat loss for this particular species is certainly still ongoing. And that's one of the reasons why it has been proposed for protection. And that is certainly going to be the case then with other species that have historically been prairie dependent. And we can all think of those butterflies that are now much less common than they used to be, whether it's prairie skippers or other types of fritillaries. And then just as another example, the butterfly that was on my cover slide there was the Nokomis fritillary from my region, the subspecies from my area in Western Nevada. And that is obviously facing a loss and degradation of habitat and is facing similar goals for federal protection as well, because of the loss of meadow habitats and degradation from water diversion and a number of different anthropogenic causes, as well as other causes. The second widespread threat that I think is really going to be exposed more and more over time here is the threats of pesticide exposure. These are obviously, I'm not picking on airplanes now, but they represent the idea. And I think one of the things that is hard for us to understand sometimes when we are involved with EPA regulations and related issues is that we believe, or we want to believe, that if we follow the label of the law, the label, and if we follow those directions and application instructions, that the drift of those chemicals off of that production landscape is going to be limited to the things that have been studied in the work to approve that chemical. And whether that's wheat or corn or alfalfa sprays, whatever it is, that is the hope and the design of those regulations. But what we are finding in our recent work is that that is simply not the case. And so just a couple quick examples. This is a study on pesticide exposure on milkweed plants from California's Central Valley. Certainly an agriculturally intensive landscape, but certainly also a place with state wildlife refuges and distance from agriculture in various places. And yet the overall point of this figure on the right is that the agricultural areas and the refuge areas and the urban areas are all littered with various types of insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. Chemicals with white dots are above the lethal concentration at 50% for monarch butterflies. Of course, those data are not available for many of these chemicals, but one that I want to point out, especially in these refuge areas, is this chemical, chlorantraniliprole, which is used on caterpillars, beetles, and aphids on a wide range of commodity crops, and was found above lethal concentrations for monarchs at multiple refuge sites. The sample size was 227 milkweed leaves from 19 sites, and there was not a single plant in any of those samples anywhere that had no pesticides at all. And the average was 9 chemicals per plant. So this is obviously a frustrating finding. The Xerces Society and colleagues are working on expanding this work. This paper has just come out in 2025 and focuses on urban locations and multiple Lepidoptera host plants in parks and yards in 2 different cities, Sacramento, California, sure, again, in the dense Central Valley with lots of agriculture, but also Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is not the same. And here again, you can see chlorantraniliprole highly represented even in urban landscapes, and you can see the diversity of chemicals that are in both of these landscapes, including one that some of us might feel are more similar to places I live in, like Reno, for example, or Las Vegas, which is not surrounded by agriculture in the way that the Central Valley is. And in this study, only 22 out of 336 samples in 2 different cities had no pesticides at all on their residue, but at least there were 22 of those samples that had no pesticides above reaching any sort of trace levels. The third major widespread threat to butterfly declines is climate change. This is something that has been discussed in several recent scientific publications, so I'm not going to get into it too much, but you can see the levels of long-term drought and the places where the U.S. Drought Monitor is suggesting that there are both short and long-term effects ongoing from this type of drought that is multi-season in various ways. And some of these areas do, including the Western U.S. especially, but also in some parts of the Northeast, correlate with butterfly declines. And so this, I think, is one that we cannot ignore. And I was just at the entomology meeting up in Portland, and Dave Wagner was just giving his own anecdotal evidence of, for example, widespread juniper die-offs in Southeast Arizona, just as one example. The last thing that I want to mention that I think offers a hypothesis for why we see widespread declines even in places where we don't have these other threats that I have mentioned quite as much. Maybe climate change is all over the place, possibly, but maybe not as much drought. or, for example, no pesticide exposure, no recent habitat loss. So this is an example from a 2023 paper that I was involved with, and this is the large marble butterfly. And there are these dots here. Let me make sure that my pointer is visible because I'm gonna do this for a minute here. These sites here relate to the dots on the map, which just shows the distribution of the butterfly and the locations of these sites over on the right here. I'm actually not going to pay attention to any of that right now, so pretend like that's not there. What I want to focus on is this extremely data-rich set by Art Shapiro at UC Davis that goes across the sites in Central California. And many of you know this story. Art has monitored these basically every other week for the last 40 plus years, oftentimes just by city bus, all the way from Sisseton Marsh through the Central Valley and Sacramento, and then up and over the Sierras. And the colors of those dots are what correspond over here. The year is on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is the proportion of visits in that year that Art saw that butterfly. So he only counted presence absence, and we know that this is highly correlated with abundance, at least in this region. And so if he saw it at 0.5, he saw essentially every other visit through the season is how much he saw it. 0 is he never saw it that season, and 1 would be he saw it every time he went out. And you can see that this butterfly is declining in places that are of concern because of the threats I have already talked about. For example, all of these places in the Sacramento Valley proper are totally extirpated at this point, essentially. But we also see that in higher locations, like this one that's, I believe, at Washington Bridge, about a third of the way up the Western Sierras, and at Castle Peak higher up, though we don't see it on the other side, on the eastern side of the Sierras. And one of the causes that I know is discussed when I chat with Matt Forrester at the University of Nevada about this data set and other individuals that are in California is the firm idea that these species, of course, are moving around. But in the Central Valley, for example, the species lower down have a feeding source level type effect. And I don't want to be too scientifically rigorous because that's not what I'm going for here, but they have a source style effect where they're feeding higher elevation populations. And the total destruction of these Central Valley populations is almost certainly having an effect on the ability of these middle elevation populations to stay established over longer periods of time. And this is an effect of reduced population size. It's an effect of changed metapopulation dynamics. It's probably an effect of changed genetic diversity. It's probably an effect of sublethal effects of widespread pesticide contamination in places we don't expect it, and so on. An even better example of this, I would say, comes from the West Coast lady. This is a figure from the same paper. And again, I'm going to block out all the other stuff that's from other places, just looking at California. You can see this is a butterfly that is in steep decline at every single location that it's been monitored at. And that again includes these low elevation locations and these extremely high elevation locations, including the high elevation site here is Castle Peak, which is one of the most butterfly diverse locations monitored in the United States, outside, obviously, of Arizona and other places that always went out and that sort of thing. So with that in mind, I want to look forward rather than talking about the depressing backward and think about how we can reverse some of these effects. And this is the focus of the last two sections of these of our publication. And so we have a very short raw section on a strategic vision to bring back butterflies. My favorite part of which is this beautiful illustration created by Faith Williams. And it just, I think, represents the idea of incorporating both the rarer species and some of the ones that still are common but in steep decline, and focusing on where they are across these different landscapes while they're still on these different landscapes before we have to go out and find them in the one place that they are left and be our own Noah's Ark. This is, I think, the goal that we are looking for. And so that is our last section of that, and it's calls to action. And we have focused these calls to action on different types of landscapes, which you can see here. And then we also have collaborative elements as well, things, the way they cross landscapes and ways in which we can engage other folks who maybe are not actively involved with conservation at the moment. And so I just want to give a couple examples of ways we can do that. And so I've focused this on the different broad categories in which we work on conservation. And one of the main ones is to, of course, start in the planning process. Whether this is land use planning for regional state agencies, State Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service offices, and so on, state wildlife refuges. When we go into the major planning process, I hope that the report and the species listed in that report, and then your research into the main scientific publication, will guide those planning processes. Of course, many of the butterflies feed on common, sometimes even weedy plants, and we can manage those in an active way. And now is the time to start doing that. And we have got 20 years of examples in the monarch world of how we can be successful in restoring and planning for summertime monarch habitat. And then you see other examples here. And then one I've added at the bottom that I just want to mention is addressing climate change in these management plans. I think one example that I think of being in the arid West a lot is the way that we have moved water around on the landscape, oftentimes in extraordinarily frustrating ways to some of us. But those are the reality we're in. And I think we need to take a hard look at the way we move water across the landscape and how we can use the way that it's being moved around to enhance butterfly habitat. And that is something that I think is not a typical approach, but I think it is oftentimes where we find butterflies in the arid West is in these agricultural or pasture management locations that have water added to them through the season. They defy some of the other locations. Expanding habitat is obviously one of the main ways in which we're going to reverse things like degraded habitats, lost habitats, fragmented habitats. None of these things that are listed on this page will be revolutionary at all. So I think we just want to reinforce the idea that we want to include not just the monarch in this sort of thing now, but we want to add some of these species onto the list. We want you to look through the list, decide what the species are that are using your habitats and how you can expand those habitats, including their butterfly biology in all of these different environments. And of course, minimizing exposure to pesticides across environments is something that's more easily said than done, but I think the more people we have thinking about it, the better we will do. Last but not least, in these different ways, we have public engagement. And this includes a number of very self-evident things as well. One thing I would point out is that any sort of larger joint venture style, exactly like your network and others beyond it, like regional associations, fish and wildlife agencies, AFWAs, and other regional groups, focusing on these butterflies with wide distributions, that's obviously going to be our best way to leverage work, is to combine them into a joint venture. The other thing that I would like to mention is that I know that a common issue with the analyses that we have done is that there are lots of missing areas. And there are many ways to contribute to this, but expanding regional monitoring and regional analyses of butterfly populations is obviously one of the goals of this analysis. This is not to be, put upon a pedestal. This is meant to be part of the foundation of butterfly research, through which we decide what regions we need to add monitoring programs and where we need more regional fine-scale analyses of what's causing different butterflies to decline and so on. I don't think that this is meant to be an end-all. And if some of the results in this 15 years from now turn out to be different than we have anticipated today, I would be happy with that outcome. I just want to point out that we also have this really fun appendix. I just like this feature of the report. So I'm just going to point out that this appendix takes these actions and just shows which landscapes and how they can be cross-collaborative. And so it's a nice summary of that sort of information altogether. And I just like it. So closing thoughts here, I just want to remind us all that the majority, I would say, of available evidence, including this large-scale analysis, suggests that many species of butterflies are in decline in many places. There's a lot of caveats nestled in those manys, and that's obviously the point. But I think the majority of evidence is suggesting we have things to pay attention to and to begin to conserve now, and that this conservation should complement and not replace the conservation of rare and endemic taxa, which we are all very in love with. There's no reason not to love a rarity and a narrowly endemic species that you have to hunt for just 1 week of the entire year. Everybody needs those too. And last but not least, these conservation efforts can include these species in many landscapes, and you can use these conservation efforts to protect and restore larger areas and enrich butterfly habitats in a way that works on conservation in an everyday way. And with that, I just want to thank our enormous group of donors and funders who support all of this sort of work. And I will say thank you. And I have my email here if I've run out of time for questions. And I really appreciate the opportunity again. So thank you very much.